ultimately it kept feeling like the movie didn't have any sort of point it was making other than, wasn't this a thing we all lived through? And we have no opinion on it as a film, and therefore you don't have to like feel any certain way about it. Even when he goes to talk about Vietnam, he's literally silenced, and we don't hear anything that could possibly be, aggravating to anybody or controversial in any way.
Welcome, friends, to episode 314 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss Robert Zemeckis' 1994 film, Forrest Gump. So after last week, I was kind of down on this project. Our patrons asked us to do this, and I was very happy to oblige. But then we read the book, and I guess I should have known, that people out there knew that the book had a bad reputation, but man, I did not like that book, and there was a lot of off-putting things about it.
Yep.
And then we were coming to this movie that I've seen many times and have fond memories of. So I was hesitant, but also excited to hopefully see a good adaptation of it.
Yeah, I mean, last week, like you said, was a rough one. One of my low points as far as reads for this podcast. I really did not like that book. And yeah, this is a movie that I saw as a child, as I think many of our generation did. Grew up with and had a lot of nostalgia for, but had not seen in probably 20 years, is my guess. Like, I probably saw it last as a teenager. There are certain films you can watch, certain books you can read at different points in your life, and it is a way to see just how much you've changed as a person. And watching Forrest Gump now in the year 2024 feels very different than it did than I remembered it. And it has me thinking a lot about like what we do on this podcast and like what the point of us talking about these things really are. So yeah, I'm excited to get into all of that. I do want to again thank the patrons for choosing this. It's an interesting one to talk about, and it's been quite a ride to revisit. But yeah, I'm really curious, James. How did nostalgia treat you this time? Was it something that you were able to just really engage with and enjoy this movie, or what?
I find myself approaching Forrest Gump differently, like you said, than I did growing up, or even more recently, because I'm thinking now about the intentions of the story in a lot of ways, and I think that a lot of it draws its roots from that book that we read, which we felt was kind of like a sour look at what I thought was a really sweet story. With Forrest Gump. Looking at it now, I see where the film did a lot to differentiate itself, but still it doesn't go far enough for my modern sensibilities in a lot of ways. Even so, I found myself enjoying this film. I've like, it starts out kind of rough. I remember like there's a bang bang of like his mother is sleeping with the principal, and then like a few other things very early on that are weird, and you're like, what the fuck is going on in this film already?
Well, she sleeps with him in exchange to get
him
Forrest into school,
public school, yeah,
which is just again one of the weird notes. There are like moments of darkness in this movie, like that orbit around Forrest's life, that he, the way he engages with them is interesting to sort of track. But like that's one of those things for sure that comes on early. Also, Jenny's sexual assault at the hands of her father, which was added, by the way, that's not in the book, and how her whole storyline plays out is quite different.
To be expected for that time period too. They're touching on some of the social unrest and like the obviously like progression that was happening in our society. Like, there was the civil rights movement. There was so much going on at the time. There was the Vietnam War that we touch on. But I felt like what the film did correct is it focused in on character, which I think we're huge supporters of on this podcast. We talk about it all the time, is like, sell me on the characters, and it doesn't like even if the messaging or their morals are different than mine, I can be engaged in a story. And I think the film does a great job of saying like, you're gonna love this Forrest Gump character in a way that you don't like the guy in the book, because I feel that he is like, he's loyal to a fault. He, of course, is seeing the world through a different lens as he has these cognitive disabilities, you would think. I think the story leads you on to believe, but they never say anything. They just kind of say lower IQ.
He just says a low IQ. Yeah, it's like below average IQ.
In going through all of this, I think to just kind of talk about it a little bit here, the thing that I'm realizing is how much more conservative valued this film is than I realized growing up. Yeah. And so much of that is like kind of painting how I think about it now, and especially what we talked about last week with Jenny and like kind of her role in the story and what it is in the book and in the film here, it's kind of like taking a dig at a lot of things that are my values. So
Right.
so it's, it's kind of a interesting ride now. But in some weird way, I do think this film is able to navigate some of that in a way that I can still enjoy the film, and it doesn't completely turn me off to watching it. And I still think that it's enjoyable, and the performances definitely help a lot. Like, you have Tom Hanks in that role, like you said, he just creates such a likable character. But I have so many other thoughts. I'll let you jump in.
Yeah.
What were you thinking now in 2024?
Yeah, man, it's tricky, right? So this is definitely better than the book. Like, get that out of the way. We don't need to wait for the end for this one. It's an improvement. Gump here is more likable. You give me a character that seems to genuinely care about people, seems to truly love deeply, even as people doubt his ability to understand love. And like, as a character, he's likable. Um, he embodies still an interesting sort of passivity that was in the character in the book, and that his whole journey is one of just like reacting to the things that happen to him, but it also like establishes sort of a Zen philosophy, just taking what life throws at you and like rolling with it, and like not having a lot of aspirations and expectations that are fucking with you, which we see affect um, the other characters like Jenny and Lieutenant Dan. All have these aspirations, and even Bubba have like aspirations. He wants to become a shrimper, and like all these things. And the aspirations in different ways can kind of fuck with them, whereas Gump is much more just rolling with the punches and taking whatever comes to him. So there's a certain mindfulness in Gump that I really like. The way that he has a meditative jogging, saga, and sort of connects with the natural world. And seems to like link that with divinity. There's a lot of things there that I do admire.
And I do think that's a great point in kind of countering what the book is, which is like him reacting to everything. That's a point where he chooses to do something, and I think he does that a few key times throughout the film that gives him so much more agency in the story.
Yeah, so those are all things I do like. I think there is a human story when he's in Vietnam with his acts of heroism and how he's just trying to save Bubba, but he ends up saving a bunch of his fellow soldiers, and there's a like sweetness to that. All of that I think is working. I like Lieutenant Dan; is a much different character in this movie, and overall, I think a big improvement and a character that I actually rather enjoy watching. Gary Sinise is great in this role. All that being said, I do think a lot of the messaging of the movie is this Americana bliss, this idea of like we're gonna look back with nostalgia at our history, specifically I think for like the Boomer generation, and
Oh
we're
yeah.
gonna look back at all of the stuff we lived through, and we're gonna just kind of go like, yeah, that was really complicated. Maybe I didn't understand all of it, but we can all just kind of laugh about it now. It's a part of us. And not engage with like the more like thorny subjects in there, and specifically I think white America, especially because like Gump is present for a lot of really big historical events. He's present at civil rights rallies. He's present at a Black Panthers meeting that is incredibly I think poorly done on this in this film. There's all these moments he's present for, but he actually doesn't really seem to have much of an opinion on them. He's just kind of there waving in the background, literally inserted into historical footage, and what for the time was a cutting edge technique. But ultimately it kept feeling like the movie didn't have any sort of point it was making other than, wasn't this a thing we all lived through, and we have no opinion on it as a film, and therefore you don't have to like feel any certain way about it. Even when he goes to talk about Vietnam, he's literally silenced, and we don't hear anything that could possibly be, aggravating to anybody or controversial in any way. And this movie seems to really want to just go like, we are apolitical, we are right down the middle neutral, and yet we support American ideals. Capitalism is at the heart of this movie, and it's celebrated throughout, and it's seen as like a way for everybody to get out of their problems. And so thus it does still have a very political message in a way that I think we're all more aware of now, where it's like this whole like, oh, we're just going to be neutral, is no longer, I think, an argument that is winnable, because like that is inherently a political stance to take too. So yeah, I bumped up against a lot of it with my like sort of progressive politics and frustration with American idealism and stuff like that, which is like so on display throughout this entire movie.
For sure. And I wonder if there's like some naivete of like the filmmakers even at this point, because I to get into a lot of this, like Hanks has stated even that the film is non-political and thus non-judgmental, which is
Yeah.
such a middle of the road stance to take. Like you said, you're
And
just
it's
standing
not.
on the fence. Yeah. Because
Yeah.
inherently making a decision in any direction
Yep.
is going to be, it's going to be motivated by your morality, the things that you see as right in the world, and many other things. And that's kind of where people's politics lie.
And by choosing to not support like anything in the movie, that is a statement. That's a political statement.
Yeah. So nevertheless, even though Hanks has stated that, CNN's Crossfire debated even in 1994 whether the film promoted conservative values or was an indictment of the counterculture of the 1960s. It's been noted that while Gump follows a very conservative lifestyle, Jenny's life is full of counterculture embrace, complete with drug use, promiscuity, and anti-war rallies, and that their eventual marriage might be kind of reconciliation.
And notably, she contracts a mysterious virus, seemingly as a result of that lifestyle, which I think is heavily implied to be HIV.
I agree. Yeah, I think so too. Although the filmmakers, specifically Zemeckis, will tell you, no, it's. I didn't even tell Jenny what it was. It could be
Yeah,
anything, and
could
you're
be
like, okay,
anything.
but it's the 1980s, so you tell me what this mysterious,
Right.
early 1980s, what could it possibly be?
Yeah.
And that does feel weirdly like almost like a punishment on
Mm-hmm.
her
Oh
for
yeah,
doing all of
her
those things that we
lifestyle
just
kills her.
said. Yes,
Yeah.
and that again is kind of wrapped up in what we've been talking about up to this point.
I do think there's an interesting way to look at the relationship between the two of them, though, and how Gump is in love with her and loves her spirit and loves her ideals. You could argue the lack of support he shows for those ideals maybe betrays a certain shallowness to that. But if this is all like deeply symbolic about the American soul and how there is like kind of the right and left and how they interact with one another and how often the right will like pretend to say like, oh yes, I support the idea of equality and the idea of social justice to an extent, and like kind of like pay lip service to a lot of it, as long as it doesn't like have any sort of actual effects on our day-to-day life and cause any sort of inconvenience to my life, then I'm going to be supportive of it, even as I kind of treat it as if it's childish. And there's sort of an attitude like that coming from the movie. But if you look at it in the other way around, it's like it's a little bit about the way that those two things interact with one another, and how I do think there is sort of a conservative sort of ideal that I grew up honestly raised on. And it's this ideal of like, we are going to treat everybody equally. And that is like tied to religion, and that's tied to our belief structure. And it's about being a good person and supporting your family. And a lot of that stuff that like, on the surface seems, of course, why not? We all can share in these values. It's just how they manifest in our politics, and how we've force them on others, force our sort of concepts of traditional life onto others. That kind of stuff that becomes tricky, right?
And there's a level of like selfishness, selflessness that comes into play of like, what are you willing to sacrifice and give up for the good of others? And, or, what are you holding on to because of others kind of thing. It does feel like Forrest Gump isn't necessarily understanding all the things that are going on around him as well. So it's like for him to be on the fence necessarily, he may represent people who are not plugged into politics in any way, which is in and of itself like a very privileged place to come from, obviously.
Well, and his ignorance and simplicity is not chosen. That's just how he is. But it also then, by extension, sort of forgives willful ignorance. And a lot
Yeah.
of people choosing to not understand things, and says like, that's okay, because then you're just being like Gump, and Gump's obviously a good dude, right?
Right. Like I said, from a position of privilege, right? Like you can't ignore politics if it's directly affecting you to the point that you can't live a life of dignity. So like it just is like, while he may not understand, and while people are supporting him throughout his life, and he is experiencing all these amazing things, we can't underestimate the fact that like all of these things that he's bumbling into, he's lucky. You know what I mean? He's lucky in a lot of ways. Jennifer Highland Wang argued in a Cinema Journal article that Jenny's death to an unnamed virus symbolizes the death of liberal America and the death of the protests that defined a decade. She also notes that the film's screenwriter Eric Roth developed the screenplay from the novel and transferred to Jenny all of Gump's flaws and most of the excesses committed by Americans in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I mean, a lot of the, Gump's sort of sharper edges are absent here. A lot of his foibles and mistakes are gone. a lot of the times that he gets drawn into the counterculture. You know, he gets addicted to marijuana in the book. All of that is gone now. The drug use is pushed onto her. He's fairly virginal throughout, instead of, you know, occasionally getting bizarre sexual relationships in the book. So yeah, I can totally see that. To say that she represents the death of like the liberal culture, yeah, maybe. You could also argue that it lives on a little bit through their son together, as he's sort of the combination of the two of them, and maybe he has some of those ideals that he's going to support as the next generation, which is a big part of this movie too, is like the passing of the torch onto the next generation, and how Gump lives on, but he's like smarter and maybe, and you know, a better person in his through his
Yeah.
child.
And I think that there will be people who will hear us saying these things and say, this movie, no, this movie does ride the line. It finds a way to be both things. It represents the Black Panthers and it shows these people here and
Yeah.
this there. But I do want to note that just in the way that fiction does affect the culture, people have noted that this possibly forecasted the 1994 quote of Republican Revolution, and an image of Forrest Gump was used to promote movement leader Newt Gingrich's traditional conservative values for the time period.
Yeah.
You can also look to the National Review, who has included Forrest Gump in its list of best 100 conservative movies of all time, and it ranked number 4 on its 25 best conservative movies of the last 25 years. So again, to say that
Yeah.
it's not taking a side is to also say that these, you know, so these specific circumstances where it is being used and pointed to as like a this is the conservative, this is the American dream that they're looking at.
Well, it's we talk about this all the time. If you aren't going to choose to take a side, that inherently supports the status quo. The current way of things, if not to be challenged, is being promoted as just or shouldn't be messed with. And so you can say, "Oh, we're not going to take sides. We're going to be apolitical here." But that immediately is saying that what we are currently doing is fine. And that is, of course, in and of itself, a political stance. That is the heart of conservatism. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, it's like the way things are, or at least the way things were, or the way they should be, right? And so, yeah, I totally see that. And also, just like the red hat, blue shirt, like clean cut look, it has been mirrored in so many rallies, right wing rallies and stuff that you see nowadays. That like when I see Forrest Gump on screen wearing that, he looks like he's going to a Trump rally.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is just, you know, it's an unfortunate side effect. You know, this day and age, I'm sure that wasn't necessarily intended, but boy,
Yeah.
does it look that way now.
And that's kind of where I was getting at with maybe some naivete, and like
Yeah,
because the filmmakers in hindsight have gone out of their way to say like, no, it's not supposed to be that. But
yeah,
ultimately, when you ingrain a certain type of storytelling, and again, this draws its roots back to the initial story that was written, there are values that come through, that bleed through. Even if this is a more progressive look at a character, it's still, or this situation and the way that he goes about it. And again, there are times, you know,
arguably.
arguably, yeah,
Yeah,
there are times that I think they made choices to move into what was seen as a much more progressive stance in 1994, and we can talk more about those as we go. But I want
mm.
to talk about Robert Zemeckis as a filmmaker a little here. He's an American filmmaker. He first came to public attention as the director of the action adventure romantic comedy Romancing the Stone in 1984. Then Back to the Future trilogy, 1985 through 1990, and the live action / animated comedy Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He subsequently directed the satirical black comedy Death Becomes Her, and then diversified into more dramatic fare, including Forrest Gump, for which he won Academy Award for Best Director. The film also won Best Picture.
Didn't it beat out Shawshank Redemption?
It did beat out Shawshank Redemption.
That is a travesty. I'm sorry.
No, I like that you brought this up because writing in 2004, Entertainment Weekly said, quote, nearly a decade after it earned gazillions and swept the Oscars, Robert Zemeckis' ode to the 20th century America still represents one of cinema's most clearly drawn lines in the sand. One half of folks see it as an artificial piece of pop melodrama, which I do want to touch on that
Hmm.
viewing of this film, while everyone else raves that it's sweet as a box of chocolates. And in 2015, The Hollywood Reporter polled hundreds of Academy members asking them to re-vote on past controversial decisions. Academy members said that given a second chance, they would award the 1994 Oscar for Best Picture to The Shawshank Redemption instead.
Yeah. We covered Shawshank Redemption on this very podcast, and I was blown away by that adaptation. Fantastic movie, has held up really well over time, I think. And just a completely different reaction to watching that. You know, this far in the future versus watching this movie this far in the future, which to me has
Yeah.
not held up nearly as well.
Other notable films that came out in '94: Pulp Fiction, which was
Wow.
one that I
Yeah,
think
you can make
people
an
would
argument for that.
possibly argue for that. Forrest Gump also won Academy Awards for Best Actor in a Leading Role. Hanks had won the previous year for Philadelphia as well, so back-to-back Best Actors. Best Visual Effects, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Film Editing all won.
Wow. I mean, it is a visually, spectacular film. I think it clearly was groundbreaking for the time, and a lot of the special effects it did. It seemed well directed to me. Is it the best of those batch? No, I don't think so. But it's hard to argue some of those other ones. I suppose.
And I mentioned Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Interestingly, when this was brought to Zemeckis' attention, this script, it was actually like still included some elements of like the ape and many other like things throughout the story. And so I think they approached him, and he thinks as well that he was approached because they wanted to do like an animation / live action thing for Forrest Gump here. Like I heard
Wow.
Jenny was going to have wings. There was going to be an ape companion, all
Wow.
animated stuff. Just wild idea.
I did hear that there was a couple other directors originally attached, who ended up leaving the project, and Zemeckis ended up being like the third choice or something.
So I saw Ivan Reitman, Penny Marshall, and Terry Gilliam all pass on the project.
Yeah, Terry Gilliam was the one that I was like kind of mind blown at the thought of Terry Gilliam doing a Forrest Gump movie.
I mean, he did pass on it, so there
Yeah,
may have
yeah, there
been a
you go.
reason there. So Zemeckis is regarded as an innovator in visual effects. His exploration of state-of-the-art special effects includes the early use of computer graphics inserted into live-action footage in Back to the Future Part 2 and Forrest Gump, the insertion of hand-drawn animation into live-action footage in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and the performance capture techniques seen in The Polar Express, Beowulf, A Christmas Carol, and Welcome to Marwen. He is known for his collaboration with composer Alan Silvestri, with whom he has worked since Romancing the Stone. David Thompson wrote that no other contemporary director has used special effects to more dramatic and narrative purpose.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a movie I haven't seen in many, many years, but I have fond memories of. I know it's also based off of a book, so that could be a potential ink to film project in the future. Would be a fun one to see that like live action animation blend, which was of course, like had not been done much at all at the time, so it would be really cool to revisit.
Yeah,
Zemeckis is a filmmaker that clearly I like a lot of his stuff. Like I like the Back to the Future films. I've seen those more recently, and I think they hold up pretty well. And did he also do Castaway?
he did.
Okay,
Yeah,
so Castaway's a good movie. I like that movie. I saw that again fairly recently. Like there's a lot of stuff in there that I enjoy. So it's
yeah.
not to say that I don't like him as a filmmaker. Yeah, it's just I don't think Gump has held up as nearly as well as a lot of those other movies have. Another point I will say to like sort of underline that, I read that and this was actually in my notes for last week's episode and I forgot to get to it, but we were talking about how there was a second book written
Mm-hmm.
and it got optioned to be adapted.
Yep.
Reportedly, the screenwriter, who you have to remind me of his name, he's done a lot of like Eric Roth or something.
Eric Roth. Yep.
Eric Roth, yeah. He like turned in the screenplay for the second movie on September 10th, 2001.
Oh yeah. There's a whole
And
thing about it. Yeah.
yeah, the whole thing about it. They all after 9/11 happened, they all looked at it and said, "We can't make this movie." And I think that's an important note because I do think this is decidedly a pre 9/11 movie. And really like this couldn't be done today. And I think there's a lot of parodies out there. I saw some really funny ones about like if Forrest Gump was made today, and you see Forrest Gump like bumbling his way to the January 6th insurrection and bumbling his way, around. It's like all this stuff that would not look good, right? The George Floyd protests and like all this stuff.
Yeah.
And you're like, this wouldn't
It's
be a good
cute.
look
It's
nowadays.
cute when you do like a little Watergate joke and
Yeah.
like he makes the call and everything, like that works, but it's not so much when it gets a lot more serious. It felt
Yeah.
like
And I feel like
there's
we've
just
lived through a
cultural
lot of
shift.
really serious shit in the last
Yeah.
20 years.
And that's not to
mildly.
say some of this stuff wasn't serious, which, we talked
That's the
about
thing,
last
it
week
was at the
how
time.
Vietnam and how Vietnam was depicted in the book, even though
Yeah.
the author was a Vietnam veteran. I was just shocked at like not taking it because it was more of a comedic book, I guess, or there was an attempt at satire there.
Yeah.
It just didn't take any of that seriously. And I do think that the film adjusts that appropriately. And I think that there is good emotion to it and there is good like
Agreed.
sacrifice being made and all of that. But to talk about what you're mentioning there, Gump and Co. was the novel sequel. It was written in '95. Like you said, it starts out with Forrest sitting on a bench waiting for his son to return from school, and then after the September 11th attacks, they felt like it just wasn't relevant anymore. And then I think Paramount maybe looked at the screenplay again in like 2007, but just realized no, we should probably leave it behind. Not to
Yeah,
mention Tom Hanks said he wouldn't do it. He's like, I'm not doing a sequel to this.
wise, wise at this point. And also, I heard that his son contracts AIDS from
Really?
Jenny, or has
Wow.
it's found to have AIDS. So
Well,
that was in the original sequel movie.
let me give you some interesting insight too. On the first page of the sequel novel, because we're not reading that, I'm just going to tell everybody right now, for no matter what, because there's not an adaptation. But Forrest Gump tells readers, "quote Don't never let nobody make a movie of your life story, and whether they get it right or wrong, it doesn't matter. The first chapter of the book suggests the real life events surrounding the film have been incorporated into Forrest's storyline, and that Forrest got a lot of media attention as a result of the film.
Yeah.
During the course of the sequel novel, Gump runs into Tom Hanks, and at the end of the novel, in the film's release, includes Gump going on the David Letterman show and attending the Academy Awards."
So if that meta sort of commentary sounds kind of cool to you, I'm going to point you towards the Princess Bride novel,
Yeah.
because this does this very well. Later editions are released that incorporate the film being made into the meta narrative surrounding the novel, and I think it does this masterfully. So yeah, go to that. Don't read Trump and Trump and Co. I can feel like I am going to like Freudian slip Trump in here a few times for Gump, because there is a little bit of a crossover here, although not fair to Gump. I think it's probably also just that the words sound really fucking similar.
Yeah, and also Robin Wright shows up in Princess Bride, and it's just an excellent
Oh, true. I didn't even think about
project in
that.
general. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Which
awesome.
I've been in love with Robin Wright since I've seen Princess Bride. So it's just like seeing her as Jenny. I know people give Jenny a lot of flack in the story, and I do think she is quite cruel at a few times, given her own motivations and everything like that. Maybe not seen
Yeah.
as cruel, but I know people come down hard on Jenny in this
Well,
story.
it's her portrayal, right? Like she's not done any favors by the
Yeah.
screenwriter here. She represents to me this like damaged person who is unable to let go of the past. So in some ways, she represents like the alternative to Gump, because Gump is like, I mean, we see Gump. He's named after the guy who invented the Ku Klux Klan, right? And from the beginning, he's told like, you're I named you that because like we all make mistakes, basically. And his whole thing is like moving on, not wallowing in the past, and just like, I mean, even at one point he's chased by these teens in a car, and it has a very prominent like rebel flag on the front bumper, and it really to me seems to represent like the sort of original sin. And I'm, what, I should go ahead and credit. There is a video essay I watched on this that I am borrowing some of these takes from, and that's called The Take. I'll link it in the show notes. It's a great breakdown of a lot of the symbolism going on with these different characters, and I agree with a lot of what they say. It's an excellent channel, but I also don't think they like go on to like make a lot of extrapolations based off of those symbolisms. They just kind of lay out the evidence. So I'm going to do some of that here, but yeah, I think Jenny sort of represents the idea of like getting caught up in your past and letting the trauma like affect your life and bring you down. And she is sort of drugged down by like her trauma from her father. And Gump is able to just move on, move past his trauma. Oh well, just go on to the next thing. And even though he's sad at times, I think that is sort of propped up as like the way to be. And there is a certain element of like mindfulness and that like I think has merit. So that's not completely a bad thing to say. But yeah, I just think Jenny is like unable to love him because she's unable to forgive herself and for unable to move on. And she keeps like seeking out toxic men who just seem to want to harm her, as frustrating as that might be for people who want her to get with Gump.
We talked about it a little last week too. The idea that like life would be nice and neat, and they would meet as kids and be these lovers that would eventually just come together, and everything would make sense. That's to take away the idea of agency of both parties deciding who they want to be with. She clearly like loves him in a certain sense, and then comes to love him in the way that he would hope. And I think that that's an interesting thing to touch in on if we're going to touch on like the idea of like who they represent as far as like political spectrums and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
that's idea to return to status quo. At the same time, like she clearly like doesn't see him in that light for such a period of time, and he's a bit of a creep about it. Not as much in the movie here, but in the book he
In the
definitely
book,
is.
major creep about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I did want to touch a little bit more on the way that this was optioned and all of that. So the book had a bidding war regarding an adaptation even before publication, which we talked last week. We were like, why
Yeah.
did people see this as a possible adaptation?
I mean, it was the 90s, man. It's a different time. It's the only thing
Yeah.
I can say. This seemed like
Right.
a really good idea, and it was ultimately, if you want to make a bunch of money, and they did.
So Wendy Finnerman and Steve Tisch acquired the rights by joining forces with Warner Bros. Finnerman and studio executive Kevin Jones had independently read the book and felt it had a potential, which I don't see what they saw, but hey, like you said, they made money. Groom, who wrote the book, was paid $500,000 and also wrote the first 3 drafts of the screenplay, which leaned closer to the events of the novel. After Rain Man's success told the story of a savant, Warner lost interest in the picture, and by 1990, the project was in turnaround, which is just development hell, basically. Finnerman contacted Columbia Pictures, who went on to reject it while hiring Eric Roth to rewrite the script. Roth and Finnerman kept in contact with Groom to ensure the script was historically accurate. Paramount was eager to make it after Tom Hanks got on board, but just when the film was about to start production, there was a regime change at the studio. Fortunately, new head of Paramount, Sherry Lansing, also loved Eric Roth's screenplay, although they eventually lowered the initial $55 million budget by $10 million. So that's important as well, because famously the author, Groom, went into a lawsuit about this because this was the second highest grossing film of the year. And yet through Hollywood accounting, he didn't see any of the residuals that he expected.
They said that the movie wasn't profitable.
Yes, they did. Well, and then to give another wild part of that, studio came to Zemeckis, Tom Hanks, and said, we need to crunch the budget here. We need to find ways to save more money here. And so they both agreed to forgo their actual payment for the film in exchange for percentages of the returns of the film. And they each made like $40 million because this movie made so much money. And then the author, for whatever reason, didn't see those percentages kicked back to him. So something to note.
For whatever reason, yes. Author's getting screwed over. As much as I don't like the book, and I don't have a lot of fondness for Groom by extension, I still like to see authors getting paid when their work is adapted. As much as different as it is, you can't deny the similarities, that this is an adaptation of the novel.
So he was contracted to get 3% of the net profits, which is a big important thing. It's the net profits. He never saw any of that, and the studio cited costs of promotion, distribution, and interest as why he was not able to see any of that money. His dispute with Paramount was later effectively resolved after Groom declared he was satisfied with Paramount's explanation of their accounting, this coinciding with Groom receiving a 7-figure contract with Paramount for film rights to another of his books, Gump & Co.
Yeah.
The film was never made, remaining in development hell for at least a dozen years, and hopefully we never do see that movie.
Yeah, I can't imagine it nowadays, yeah.
So we talked a little bit about him, but Eric Roth is the screenwriter here. He has been nominated for 6 Academy Awards for Best Adapted Screenplay: Forrest Gump, The Insider, Munich, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, A Star is Born, and Dune 2021. So he adapted the screenplay for Dune, which we love so much. Yeah. I read a quote that Zemeckis had about what he did with the script here. He said, quote, "The writer, Eric Roth, departed substantially from the book. We flipped the 2 elements of the book, making the love story primary and the fantastic adventures secondary. Also, the book was cynical and colder than the movie. In the movie, Gump is a completely decent character, always true to his word. He has no agenda and no opinion about anything except Jenny, his mother, and God."
Yep. That's accurate.
Yep. I do think it's interesting and important to note too, like the idea, like I said, of switching to a more character focused story rather than the going into space, which just to tell people who haven't read the book, he's in space with an ape, and then they end up on an island with cannibals, and then at the end, the ape is completely able to communicate with Forrest Gump, and eventually they are working together for Gump & Co., the Bubba Gump shrimp company.
It's very different. Really, the whole second half of the book completely diverges. and then only in some ways comes together in a similar fashion as the end of this movie, but even that's pretty different.
And if I was to give like praise towards this film, which I do think this is a good movie, I do think that people who love it, there's a reason that they love it. The heart of all of it, that is the through line. If you want to look at it through the rosy glasses of nostalgia, well, I admit that it doesn't line up with my beliefs. There are characters here that you grow to love and that have motivations that you understand, and they like, especially Forrest Gump is this like character that you are rooting for and you want to see succeed because he is willing to, in an interesting way, sacrifice his own happiness, whether he realizes it or not, for the greater good and for other people, and just the way that he has so much more to do in this story versus the book. So it's just like, it's not a high bar to cross, but I'm so much more captivated by Tom Hanks' performance here, and like the overall look of like the, getting him into this footage it's really cool. I mean,
Yeah.
growing up and even now I
Some of
look
it's
at
a
the
little
footage.
uncanny now, but
Yeah, it is.
it looked good for the time. I
It
have to
did.
remember that. So yeah, I mean, as you said, that you like this movie. I don't know that I do anymore. And that's kind of where I came, and it was like a realization I had to sleep on. Like I watched this last night, and I was like, man, I don't know how I feel about this movie. And when I woke up, I was like, I do know how I feel about it. I don't like it. And this is a movie I used to like. And there are things about the movie I like, and I will continue to highlight them. There are moments I like. There are character decisions I like. There are cool things about this movie that I can enjoy. But just my overall sense of the movie used to be a net positive, and I'm largely in that, to the positive side. And now it's more of a negative. It's overall, I just don't really like this movie very much. I'm not going to have any desire to watch it again after this,
Yeah.
which is sad to say since it's such a, piece of nostalgia for people. Um, and like, I guess, like, I don't know, like, people might be mad, I imagine, for me saying this. If you are someone who shares sort of our progressive politics in any way, I would recommend watching this movie again if you haven't seen it recently. Really, anytime since post like 2016 or so, and see if it holds up as much to you as it once did. Maybe it still is a movie you can enjoy. I'm not going to argue with anybody there, but to me, it feels too conservative. It feels too, um, and it's funny because it's not like I'm projecting that onto it. It's in the movie, and in fact, that seems to be the core message of the movie now. It just, like, I don't know, wasn't as apparent at the time, and I wasn't as aware of it at the time, and it wasn't as important to me at the time. So where I'm at now, I don't know. It's like I just can't. I don't know. We'll get into the plot and we'll talk about, different moments. But yeah, I just wanted
Yeah,
to
I'm
get that
interested to
out
dig
there.
more into that because, yeah, I have nostalgia for it, no question. But I think at the same time, like, I'm willing to look at a film like this and say, yeah, it's got values that I don't agree with, but the overall story being one that when you watch this film, you're gonna get a sense of like this like amusement park ride through the past, and it's like
Hmm.
this again. It's not going to dig in on those topics because the film wasn't made to be that. It was made to be this kind of broadly appealing emotional journey that you go on with the
And
characters.
it is
And I
largely a
think,
comedy too, which I think
yeah.
is something to remember. Like, it's supposed to be funny, and
So
it
I think
is.
there's enough there for me to like say, oh yeah, it's from 1994 about the 60s and 70s, and I can get why, because ultimately like progression is just that. It's the moving of more equality, more, progressive ideals, and accepting of being more accepting of everyone. But we can look back at history and know that wasn't that, like, the progressives of the past were we would consider conservative at this point. And that's kind of like, all in all, taking the film that came out in the 90s and at things that were happening in the 60s and 70s, where I see this film currently. But let's jump in the plot, and like you said, we can dig more into this. In 1981, at a bus stop in Savannah, Georgia, a man named Forrest Gump recounts his life story to strangers who sit next to him on a bench. In 1951, in Greenbow, Alabama, young Forrest is fitted with leg braces to correct a curved spine and is unable to walk properly. He lives alone with his mother, who runs a boarding house out of their home that attracts many tenants, including a young Elvis Presley, who plays the guitar for Forrest and incorporates Forrest's jerky dance movements into his performances. On his first day of school, Forrest meets a girl named Jenny Curran, and the two become best friends. Forrest is often bullied because of his physical disability and low intelligence. While fleeing from several bullies, his leg braces break off, revealing Forrest to be a very fast runner. This talent eventually allows him to receive a football scholarship at the University of Alabama in 1963, where he is coached by Bear Bryant and witnesses Governor George Wallace's stand in the schoolhouse door, during which he returns a dropped book to Vivian Malone Jones. Forrest becomes a top kick returner, is named on the All-American team, and meets President John F. Kennedy at the White House. After graduating college in 1967, Forrest enlists in the U.S. Army. During basic training, he befriends a fellow soldier named Benjamin Buford Blue, nicknamed Bubba, who convinces Forrest to go into the shrimping business with him after their service. In 1968, they are sent to Vietnam, serving with the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta region. After months of routine operations, their platoon is ambushed while on patrol, and Bubba is killed in action. Forrest saves several wounded platoon mates, including his lieutenant Dan Taylor, who loses both his legs and is awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism by President Lyndon B. Johnson.
We've already touched on some of this stuff, so I'm not going to like repeat that stuff. I'll focus on things we haven't talked about yet. For one, I think an important symbol that we can touch on is the feather that flies down at the start of the movie and returns at the end prominently, right? So to me, this all has to deal with like basically what Lieutenant Dan talks about, where he says that he has a destiny, right? And he's all mad about his destiny that he thought he had, and then Gump ruins it. And by saving his life, he doesn't die for his country as he thought he was destined to do. And
as all of his ancestors had done as well.
And as all his ancestors had done. And then like he continues to have all this grief and trauma about how his life is not going according to plan. Gump, on the other hand, is, following the whims of the world, just blowing around like a feather. And in many ways is more chaotic. And yet, also at the same time, there's always this heavy implication on Trump's part. God damn it.
Did it. He did it.
Did it again. On Gump's part, that it is like divinely influenced, right? That God has some sort of plan. It's mysterious. This comes up. It's something that his mama says. And that, a time and again, we see evidence of that in the film. And then even later on when he gives his speech at Ginny's grave, he says that it's both, right? That we have a destiny and that we're also, things just kind of randomly happen. And I think that's what this feather represents, right? Like it does appear to be windblown and random, and yet it lands at Gump's feet, right? So obviously it is directed in some way. And it seems to sort of bless his life. I think that's an important thing to sort of note throughout is the role of the feather and what it's trying to say about like determinist destiny and destiny that you can sort of create for yourself and trying to find a middle ground between those two.
I think it's an interesting element and a visual effect that we can talk about that was like pretty cutting edge for the time period. It doesn't even seem like Gump really understands the like he at one point like picks it up and puts it in the book. Yep. But outside of that, we don't see him like really acknowledging the feather. It's just symbolic.
It's like the way that like God touches your life without you realizing it. It's kind of the implication, right?
And we have interpretations from some of the people involved here. Hanks interpreted the feather as our destiny is only defined by how we deal with the chance elements to our life. And that's kind of the embodiment of the feather as it comes in. Here is this thing that can land anywhere and that it lands at your feet. It has theological implications that are really huge.
Yeah.
And then Sally Field's interpretation was comparing it to fate, saying it blows in the wind and just touches down here or there. Was it planned or was it just perchance?
And talking about chance, one of the things with Gump is that we see throughout, he is at the heart. He's kind of like the secret catalyst of American history. He's there with Elvis, right? And it's his dance that inspires Elvis. It's his words later that inspire John Lennon to write Imagine. He helps kick off, Shit Happens bumper sticker and the smiley face. Like there's all these moments of Americana that he's at the heart of and that he touches, with his life, even accidentally, inspiring things. And there's sort of a like wish fulfillment, I think, for the American ideal, right? And the idea that could be us, that, all these people just have to be receptive to this kind of inspiration that might be considered divine by this figure in Gump, right? I don't know. I mean, I like it okay. I guess. Like, it's interesting, thing to put into film.
I mean, I think it definitely does come down on the side of being like believing in a God, right? Like this is clearly a story that
probably
believes
part
in
of
God.
my problem is I don't.
Yeah, exactly. And so like and again, I can appreciate a story that's like, hey, God exists in this world, and that's kind of like what
Exactly.
we're getting at.
Right.
And those are the characters' values as
Yeah.
well, right?
And like
Especially
if
in this
that's
time
seen as a
period.
fantasy world, that's one thing. But of course, this is seen as our world, right?
Correct.
So one iconic scene from the film is when Gump is running away from those bullies and runs out of his leg braces, right? Like
Hmm.
literally miraculously overcomes his disability. And in a moment of sort of inspiring divine intervention, is seen to be this amazing runner, which then goes on to like carry him through life and be one of the things that carries him forward. Um, and like that inherently, as someone who is disabled now, it's not a great look.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this long history of people call it inspiration porn that you'll see on the internet shared often, and it's usually stories of people who in some way have overcome a disability, and how that makes a lot of the able-bodied people watching it just feel better about themselves, feel like, if something were to ever happen to me and I were to, God forbid, become disabled, I could rise above it. I could get back to being able-bodied where we all should want to be. You know, there's some unfortunate implications. Do I think it's intended that way? Usually not. I think usually there are good intentions behind it, and it is genuinely okay to be inspired by some of these moments. This is one example where I think it is very contrived, though, and it is directly being shown to be almost this divine miracle. And it's just kind of weird. It's like, what is the message we're supposed to take away from this? Just that, like, maybe God will intervene, and like this is a moment that I guess we should all hope happens. I don't know. Like
Yeah.
again, I kept at different times in this movie, I kept wondering like, what is the message here? Why
Yeah,
is
it's
this
interesting.
supposed to be like a great moment that we're cheering on?
It's like implied with the doctor visit at one point that they're trying to like straighten his back or
Yeah,
some science that I don't understand or medical
yeah, it's
stuff that I
probably
don't
bunk
understand.
anyway.
I'm sure it's bullshit, but the idea of and I think about this often when there's stories that have someone who has a disability and then they do like the often you'll see like a someone who is in a wheelchair
Hmm.
and they have this miraculous moment where they can walk in some way. And I always think of first I'm like, yes, but how would someone in a wheelchair like react to this moment? Would they find that to be interesting?
Right, like so
Uh,
in the audience, you mean like watching it? Yeah,
in the audience, yeah. And this one is kind of just done for the fact that like he could have just been a good runner from the start. He didn't
that's what he is
like
in the
if you
book.
wanted to write that in the yeah, if you wanted to write this into the story. But yeah, there's this sense of like destiny or
Yeah.
whatever that's surrounding Gump. So that's him.
Well, it's also like maybe the hardship leads to him being spectacular.
I think society, the movie would have you believe that society is imposing like limits on this character. And like early on, they're showing a moment when he overcomes the
Yeah.
society's limitation on him or something
Right,
like that.
like
But
the
again, it doesn't.
braces are seen as society forcing him into a disability that he doesn't actually have, I guess, would be the
Oh no,
implication there.
I sort of mean more like he also has this low IQ, and so he's not going to be able to go to
Right,
the
which society's going to then try and force him into a certain kind of life that he
and
wants to break out of.
he's gonna continually like overcome them through his own effort or divine intervention or whatever you want to call that.
Combination of the
Yeah.
two, the movie would probably tell you.
Yeah. Not that I'm saying. I mean, it's iconic.
Yeah.
I would say visually, it's cool to see them
Also,
break out in
ironic.
slow
I put
motion.
this in our Instagram in an Instagram story I made. Ironic that this moment of a bunch of bullies of Forrest running away from them and this triumphant moment has became the go-to quip of every like unoriginal bully, across high schools and middle schools around the country and around the world, probably yelling "Run, Forrest, run" at the kid that they want to bully.
I guess that I would just point to the fact that most bullies are not the sharpest tools
Yeah.
in the shed. So there's that. There's that
Oh
going
no,
for it.
it's not the movie's fault for that. It's just ironic that
But
became
between
the
that,
thing.
Run Forest Run is just like something that is so ubiquitous. Like I
Yeah.
remember if you grew up in this generation, you heard it countless times. And then the other one
And it
is
was
left
probably
is like
shouted at you at least once, if not
sure.
more.
And then life is like a box of chocolates, and is so like these
Yeah.
lines are like, if I don't know,
Which
they
is like
seem
kind of
like,
banal to me now too.
yeah,
Like I don't
it's like
particularly love that. It's like you never know what you're gonna get. Okay, like what are you saying? Like that's so obvious.
usually they come with labels too. Like you can look at the
Exactly,
label
not
that
even
has the
true.
type
Like
of
it
chocolate.
tells you
Yeah,
what they are.
well, you can
Yeah.
read and overcome that, I guess, too.
Well, and that does touch on a sort of essential recurrent theme here too, though, in that the folksy wisdom of from Mama, right, becomes sort of Gump's like guiding light throughout this movie, and it's things like that she says over and over again, and it simplifies a complex world for him. I do think it is funny that Gump is described as being the ideal soldier, right? Like the drill sergeant loves him. Just
Yeah,
like
says
yells
he's
at
gonna
him
be
that
a
he's a
general.
genius, that he
Yeah,
should be a general, like all this stuff. And like I do think that is like a sort of a backward dig at the military in a sense, right? Like that this is what they value in their soldiers, people who don't question anything, who only like single-mindedly focus on their task. Some people will see this as a thing to look up to aspire to be, like I should be like Gump. I think it is noteworthy also though that as much as I give Gump shit for his like always following sort of the status quo and orders, like people tell him to do things and he does them, um, he notably defies orders when it comes to Bubba later, because Lieutenant Dan is his superior officer, like his commanding officer, and Lieutenant Dan tells him to drop him first off several times and he ignores that, and then tells him not to go back in, and he does. So the time that he chooses to defy those orders is to go rescue his friend Bubba, showing that the sort of at maybe the core of Gump there is a values that is maybe more important than the sort of structures of authority, which then I think is a value I think we could all celebrate here, right? Like just because the authority is telling you something is right doesn't mean it is, and that maybe it is right to occasionally defy that.
and I've heard from soldiers and just in general, you'll hear people talk about this, but like once you're there, once you're in once you are in the military, you're not fighting for the country necessarily. You are, but you're not fighting for the military. You're fighting for the person that's next to you, right? And so like this is, I think, possibly where someone can look at this too and say like, yeah, I'd also run back in there for my brother. I'd run back in there and do the right thing. And just showing like that's a tweak in the character that that wasn't in the book, that I do appreciate here. And it's a universal thing that yeah, of course you would do something like this to save the ones you love, and it's just extrapolating that out to the whole country and everyone, that I think some people struggle with this at times.
Also, we should note that Bubba is a white man in the book and changed to black here. So that changes this dynamic. It makes it feel a little more wholesome and inclusive, right? The idea that his best friend is a black man. And even if at times when it doesn't handle this particularly well, that's an element that the screenwriter brought that I think was definitely needed for this to be more palatable. I will also recommend, if you are interested in a book about Vietnam, I would recommend The Things They Carried. It's one of my favorite books, and a very different look at Vietnam. Yeah, unfortunately, I do think as much as I like this scene, the lasting effect of it was it feels like that was the reason Gump went, right? Like it kind of makes it feel right. Like it's like he was there to be a hero. He was there to save people, and in a way that justifies the war for him. In a way that I think that the prevailing attitude towards Vietnam was that it was a senseless war that we shouldn't have been involved in. I don't know all the details, but like that is sort of the prevailing feeling, and I think Lieutenant Dan sort of embodies that after the fact. And yet it's him coming around to having the fight with God that he has, and then accepting his life now, where finally we see him find some peace. But yeah, he's the one who is tortured by Vietnam in a way that Gump is not.
And ultimately, like him saving Lieutenant Dan like has stuff going forward that we can touch back in on, as far as like how it affects his character and helps him in ways. And it kind of seems again like this whole determinism thing, it was fated to happen this way. But yeah, the I do love how he honors his friend and wants to start this shrimping company, and like it's taken more seriously in the movie here. Like it's not it was kind of played up in the book to be something a little different.
He keeps putting it off time and time again. He goes to space. He becomes a wrestler. He does all this other stuff in the intervening time before he finally gets around to doing the shrimping thing that he had been saying he was going to do.
And you could say this is like the showing that he's Gump's willing to put in that hard, honest work, and he's going to go
Yes.
do all this other stuff. But I do think that the way that it handles like going and visiting Bubba's grave and seeing his family and all that kind of stuff does again bring that emotional through line. And then the way that he takes to the shrimping and the way that like he's so excited when Lieutenant Dan shows up, and we can talk more about
Yeah.
Lieutenant Dan. You talked about how like the plug is pulled at one point and we don't hear his thoughts on the
Oh yeah.
Vietnam War
He's
in
giving the
general.
speech. Yeah.
And again, in kind of a taking back of this material, I have heard that Tom Hanks says that when the plug was pulled, the quote that he said was, "Sometimes when you go to Vietnam, they go home to their mamas without any legs. Sometimes they don't go home at all. That's a bad thing." That's all I have to say about that. So
Mm.
that is definitively making a stance, but it's
Yep.
not in the movie. So
And it's not even. It's a pretty mild one, but
yeah.
instead they go for. I guess it's kind of a joke, right?
Yeah, I think you get like from the reaction. This is again the story playing on the fence of being like we want both parties. If you're just thinking on a political spectrum, we want both parties to react good to this. So cut off what Forrest Gump says. Everybody's still on his side, and then have the guy who's standing next to him that's clearly anti-war like have a reaction that's like, "Oh my God, man, thank you for saying that. That's really moving."
Yeah.
And then everybody wins. Is kind of the
right.
look at it.
Yep. We're just left to imagine and fill in for ourselves, I think, right?
Yeah.
Everybody can sort of fill in whatever it is that you think he should have said in that moment. That's what he said.
Which can be a powerful device in storytelling, but here it does it cops out a little bit throughout the story. Don't think there's any question about that. In order to be broadly appealing,
in a vacuum, it's not the worst. It's not the worst crime or anything. It's fine. It was a choice.
So, at an anti-war march on the Pentagon rally, Forrest meets Abby Hoffman and briefly reunites with Jenny, who has been living a hippie lifestyle. He also develops a taste for ping pong and becomes a sports celebrity as he competes against Chinese teams in ping pong diplomacy, earning him an interview alongside John Lennon on the Dick Cavett Show, influencing the song Imagine. He spends the 1972 New Year's Eve in New York with Dan, who has become an embittered disabled veteran. Forrest soon meets President Richard Nixon and is put up in the Watergate complex, where he unwittingly exposes the Watergate scandal. Discharged from the army, Forrest returns to Greenbow and endorses a company that makes ping pong paddles. He uses the earnings to buy a shrimping boat in Bayou La Batterie, fulfilling his promise to Bubba. Dan joins Forrest in 1974, and they initially have little success. After their boat becomes the only one to survive Hurricane Carmen, they pull in huge amounts of shrimp and create the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company, after which Dan finally thanks Forrest for saving his life. Forrest returns home to his mother, and she dies of cancer. Dan invests into what Forrest thinks is some kind of fruit company, and the two become millionaires. But Forrest also shares their earnings with the community and Bubba's family. In 1976, Jenny returns to stay with Forrest, recovering from years of child abuse, drugs, and prostitution. After a while, Forrest proposes to her. She tells Forrest she loves him, and the two have sex, but she leaves the next morning. Heartbroken, Forrest goes running and spends the next 3 years in a relentless cross-country marathon, becoming famous again before returning to Greenbow. In 1981, Forrest reveals that he is waiting at the bus stop because he received a letter from Jenny, who asks him to visit her. Forrest is finally reunited with Jenny, who introduces him to their son, Forrest Gump Jr. Jenny tells Forrest she is sick with an unknown incurable virus, and the three move back to Greenbow. Jenny and Forrest finally marry, but she dies a year later. The film ends with Forrest seeing his son off on his first day of school.
All right. So the rest of the movie here, lots of different stuff to touch on. It did remind me that we should note that the framing device of the bench where he's telling different random strangers his life story, that was a movie invention. And I think one of the more iconic things about the movie, honestly.
And quite funny, too, like him sitting and like just continuing the story to the next person who comes up to the bench and stuff.
And it is quite funny when you learn about him, like how he ran across the country like 3 times, the fact that he's sitting on this bench like several blocks away from where he needs to be. Even if it was like miles, like why is this guy just sitting here? He can run across the entire country, like clearly.
Yeah. Well, he's wearing nice clothes, so he doesn't want to mess those up, obviously.
But the same shoes.
But I want to talk about the running scene because I think it's one that stands out in my mind. And again, I think it's definitely a moment for him to do something that he wants to do. That's not, no one tells him to do this.
One of the biggest Nike ads ever made, I think.
Yeah, probably is. This was, so when budget cuts were coming from the studio to this film, they asked Tom and Robert Zemeckis, Tom Hanks and Robert Zemeckis, to take pay cuts, and they did, and they took percentages instead, and they said cut the running scene because it's all over the country. We don't need that. So without their permission or without them knowing, Zemeckis decided to send a crew to film all of this, and Jim Hanks is Tom Hanks' younger brother, did the doubling for running across the
Oh,
U.S. So
interesting.
all these different locations that they were filming and stuff, they did that out of their own pocket, Tom Hanks and Robert
I
Zemeckis.
remember thinking it
So
kind of looked like it wasn't really Tom a couple times.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, they put the big beard on him and stuff, so
Yeah.
that does it. And he's got like the very distinct run.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I like the scene a lot. It's always stood out to me. It's something
Some
that's like
beautiful
again kind of
sequences,
that.
honestly.
Oh yeah, and I think that's why they felt like it should be in the movie too.
Yeah.
Is like just getting to see that kind of stuff.
A
And
lot of those Zen moments I talked about where he returns
exactly,
to those moments, right? He's like, oh, when I was running, when he's talking to
people want
Jim.
to go. This is the kind of adventure that the book was going for that makes more sense in the film. And this is something that like I think a lot of people see and they're like, wouldn't it be romantic to just leave the world behind and run across the country, see everything, see all this beauty, and then this group of people start to follow him, and he becomes like this famous person because he's doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of like he's a cult leader at a certain point, although he's like silent. But they like a cult almost forms around him, right? And then they turn around, they're like, "Quiet, he's gonna say something," and he's like, "I'm gonna go home now," or whatever he says. It's pretty
I'm
funny.
sure many fitness programs could be seen as cult like for sure.
Oh,
Yeah,
for sure.
running for 3 years nonstop or whatever he
Yeah,
does.
I
Yeah.
mean, like this would be very bad for your health. I can't help but imagine that
People do it. People do it. I
for
mean, it
three
depends on.
years straight.
Well, not for three
That's
years,
my point.
but
Like this,
running
I
across the
think this
country.
would
I mean,
probably kill you.
it absolutely could. I read a story about someone who ran from the southernmost tip of Africa all the way up and through Europe and everything, and like that's
Yeah.
that's intense. And they survived it. So
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's again, like, this is kind of a fantasy, right? Because, like, the implication is that he doesn't, like, rest. Like, he just, like, I guess sleeps for the night and always keeps running the next day. Whereas I think if you were to really do this, you would have to take breaks. Like, you couldn't keep this up. And plus, like, running is such a high intensity form of exercise that, like, it
I mean,
fucks
it's
with
very
your
difficult on
knees,
your
like,
joints. Oh
stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
knees and ankles
Yeah.
and back. Yeah, it's
Now, if he
definitely
was
not
on a
gonna.
bike or something, I could totally see it. But running
Yeah,
is just such a high impact way to travel. Like, I don't know.
running. I mean, people talk about it all the time. I have a lot of friends who are like long distance, like intense runners, and nobody gets out of the sport without like you get so much out of it, a lot of cardiovascular health, but you're also going to walk away with injuries.
Yeah.
There's no question.
The
So
first guy who ever ran the marathon, right? That it was like named after. He like died when he got to the end. Right. So there you go. Like it's not supposed to be like you run 22 miles and you're fine
it's
afterwards.
unnatural. We're human being, like our bodies were meant to be short bursts of energy
Yeah,
and
and people like by
running.
the time they're done with marathons, they're like bleeding. They're like shit themselves sometimes. Like this, it's really tough on the body.
It is. It's about that mind over matter thing, and clearly Forrest has plenty of that here.
How many back to back marathons is it to run across the nation like 3 times or
I
whatever
don't
he
know.
does?
Someone will
It's a
do the
lot.
math, I'm sure. Yeah. Another thing, just with the running, I wanted to note is the score in the film is like one of the most successful as far as like Billboard charts and record sales and everything like that. The soundtrack,
Yeah, soundtrack.
all in all,
Yeah.
is
It's
so
it's just a highlight reel for all of the like most iconic
50s,
songs
60s, 70s, yeah.
of those eras. Yeah, it's great.
And I've talked before about like how it's a little bit of a cheat code. I think it's interestingly like Pulp Fiction did some of that as well, right? Like taking popular music, and many movies have done it since. But
I do feel like
that
Tarantino usually goes for deeper cuts. They're more
Oh,
well
yeah.
known now because of the movie like sort of elevates them, whereas these were like these are the hit songs of these eras, right?
For sure, yeah, and the studio didn't want to pay for him, but by the time they saw some of the footage of the running and like he kept
Vietnam.
all the music in the film, like he placed it in the film and was like, yeah, we'll get the rights later, and didn't tell anybody, and then eventually they were like, yeah, well, I guess we'll pay for the rights because the movie's so good, so they ended up doing that.
One of the other parts that stood out to me from that description you read was the moment he invests in Apple, which I got a kick out of. I was like, oh yeah, you invest in Apple, you make a ton of money. And then I was realizing this was 94.
Yeah, they're making commentary on a 94.
I was
That's
like,
unbelievable.
damn, so it must have really exploded probably in the early 90s, which I think is probably accurate. But if you could go back and invest in Apple in 94, you'd be doing really
Sure.
well at this point.
I mean, that's literally
yeah.
like yeah, that if you had been like, oh, maybe that's a good investment based on the movie Forrest Gump, and
Yeah.
you made like $100 investment or $1,000 investment, you'd be
Yeah.
good to go for
Yeah.
sure in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, if you just stuck with it, yeah, totally, man. Interesting, yeah. But this all ties back into the idea of capitalism And I wanted to touch on that a little bit here too at the end, because he lives the capitalist dream, right? Like he gets out of the military, he's served his country now. Now he goes and through the, bootstrapping his way to being a shrimp boat captain, and making his fortune. But it's divine intervention also, because there's a huge hurricane that wipes out the entire shrimping industry and every boat but his. And so he's in, deep South Louisiana with a bunch of black fishermen and shrimpers. And instead, they're all, their livelihood is destroyed in this moment of divine intervention. And Gump and Lieutenant Dan, two white men, instead become the kings of shrimping.
By sheer dumb luck.
Sheer dumb luck.
They were in the hurricane, or else they also...
It's dumb luck plus divine intervention is the only way you can describe it. And then there's an interesting thing that happens where he decides to give the other half of his take, the other half of what his earnings, and give it to Bubba's mother and family.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, Lieutenant Dan thought I was crazy for doing this, but I do it anyway. And it is a sweet gesture, right? Of course. And it shows that she no longer has to ever cook shrimp again for anyone. And then we've been seeing these like inserts where we see images of her ancestors, black women, serving white people. Usually, I think they're white men in every time. One of them clearly is like on a plantation. It's showing sort of the history of her family and the oppression of her people,
yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is through a gift from Gump that she is elevated out of poverty. And so it's both through capitalism and through the benevolence of a white man that she is lifted out of her poverty.
White savior,
white savior.
Yeah, to use the term white savior. Yeah. If you look at it in a vacuum about just Bubba and Forrest Gump, it's sweet and it makes so much sense. If you look at it in the larger context of what these
symbolically represent, right?
Yes, it's pretty fucking wild. Yeah, it's again, pretty much the biggest white savior moment, and it's like, again, in a movie that's obviously catering to a white audience, and it's saying like, you don't have to feel bad at all. Look, we're making reparations here, which I think a lot of people that watch the film probably don't agree with reparations.
Well, that's the other thing is that even if it's viewed as reparations, like that's something that a lot of people wouldn't like. But maybe it kind of makes the argument for that, if you want to look at it that way, that maybe reparations are something that should be paid, because ultimately access to financial stability is something that can improve the lives of people who have historically not had that.
Yeah, I want to touch too on Lieutenant Dan here and his fight against God on the mast of that ship.
Yeah,
because I do identify and think that that's cool.
Yeah, I remember loving that moment as a kid. I love that moment now. He's like up there screaming at God.
He's strapped onto the mast and just like, something about like maybe God will intervene or something like that. And then Gump is like, it's funny that he said that right then because God did intervene and this big storm comes. And then again, to get the counterpoint to what the movie is saying is there's a God and it's all, it's all for a reason, everything like that. Then you get at least a character raging back against that.
Although he's ultimately proven wrong, right? And there's the important scene where he jumps into the water and is sort of backstroking his way, and then the camera pans up and we see a modified sky. I could definitely tell they tried to make the clouds and everything look a little more heavenly and celestial. So definitely, why do that? Because you are making the point that Lieutenant Dan is sort of like now at peace with God, and God is now shining upon him,
like born again, or like some sort of he's found Jesus or whatever. I mean, the movie's definitely not going to pull the punches there, and by the end of the movie, I think you can see that Lieutenant Dan would view himself in this moment as like lost and everything like that.
Yeah. And whether or not he's definitely like a Christian or anything, I think is fully, you could argue that that's not the case, but he's found some sort of spirituality, and like, I'm okay with that ultimately. I don't have anything against that for people. They find a lot of value in that, and I could see that for Lieutenant Dan. It's in the larger context of the movie, it reads a certain way, but I think it can be read different ways for sure.
So I talked about how this film won Best Visual Effects at the Academy Awards, and just to talk about some of that, Ken Ralston and his team at ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, were responsible for the film's visual effects. Using CGI techniques, it was possible to depict Gump meeting deceased people and shaking their hands. Hanks was first shot against a blue screen, and then they would use reference markers in there so that he would know where to look and speak and react to. And then he was added in with special effects used to alter the lips and dialogue of what some of the people in the scenes were saying. I think you can see that
Yeah, really early deep fake kind of shit.
it's the chroma key, image warping, morphing, rotoscoping stuff. They're just using all the techniques they could to kind of manipulate the footage, and you can see it. There's no question. But it's 94,
Yeah.
and it's still kind of fun.
Smartly
to
using
see.
grainy black and white footage often that
Yeah.
holds up to that a little better.
And then obviously they had to CGI remove Gary Sinise's legs for a lot of it.
Yeah.
And I guess they're
And that looks
mostly
pretty
just
good
like
to this day. Yeah, you can kind of tell sometimes, but like, yeah, it looks good.
They wrapped his legs in sort of like blue material of some kind, and then just keyed that out and painted everywhere his legs were. And there's actually one shot of him pulling himself into the wheelchair where you can see, I guess, like him using his legs for support to push himself up there.
It did look kind of funny when he did
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They also use cutting edge techniques to add giant rallies and crowds and stuff at like the reflecting pool in DC, and they just added tons of extras and everything like that. And then the feather there's like a practical element and a CG element to it, but I mean, obviously, I think it looks pretty good for what it is.
Yeah.
And you can tell that like around the time of Jurassic Park, this is clearly like in that same realm of visual effects. And most of it holds up pretty well, and it's cool to see in like more kind of grounded story to see CG being used like this, because it's just the norm now. It's in every film, no matter what genre.
Right. As a piece of cinematic history, this is a cool moment, right? And there's definitely some effects here that I hadn't seen before. And I remember like the inserting him into the footage was like everybody lost their minds about that. Like it was so cool and it had not been done before. So, hats off to that. I do think we should talk about Jenny here at the end, because that's the way this story ends. They reunite, right? Jenny at first like comes home. I guess two separate moments. Jenny comes home and stays with him for a while. She throws a bunch of rocks at her old family home, kind of sort of showing again that she has been like irrevocably harmed by her upbringing and her trauma, and she can't let it go. And the implication is that that's why she can't allow herself to accept Gump's love here. And yeah, I guess she keeps running away, right? That's the implication. Even the taxi driver says, "Where are you running to?" And she denies it, but I think the implication is that she is running away, and she's running away from like all the things that are seen as good and wholesome, and that continues to get her into trouble. And that, of course, after she does that, they have sex one time. It's like one time that we see Gump have sex in the movie. Then she leaves, right? So she's also like, she's sexualized from the jump, because we start off with her being sexually assaulted by her father. Also, the first time Gump meets her, he's immediately taken with her, being the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. Sexualized throughout, in a sense that she's not treated as like another person, largely. And then I also was frustrated with her in certain scenes where she was really passive, right? Like even these moments where the bullies come, she just yells at Forrest to run and doesn't really do anything. And I don't know, it seems like she's just this character orbiting around Forrest, and then ultimately the role she plays in the movie is very much to serve his story, to die at the end, to create a sad moment. But
It's sort of like a fantasy wish fulfillment too for people who are watching the movie, because it's like and specifically the conservative lean to it is like she represents someone he can save, and he can be the savior again here, and they make everything right, and he can fix her, and that's implied throughout. And then he's constantly jumping in and doing that. He's punching the guy in the face when he's treating her like, which again, props to him for fighting back against somebody who's hitting a woman like that, or anyone like that. But it turns into like a prize for him to be won. Like love is like a prize in this for Forrest at the end of the story.
Every time they reunite, he leads off with an act of violence. Sometimes more justified than others. The first time he is sort of assaulting her, I guess, boyfriend or the man she's with in the car, when they seem to be having more of a consensual encounter. Although, admittedly, I did hear the words "no" at one point being uttered by her. So I think the movie tries to imply that maybe there was something going on there. It sort of makes us feel a little bit better about that moment, right? Which has a parallel in the book. The next time, I think she's singing naked in front of the audience members who get rowdy and grabby. He fights several of them, and then he fights the boyfriend, who is definitely abusive. in a moment where, of course, we would back that up. But I think it's important to know that every time it's Gump coming in with violence, right? And that's like winning her over and saving her. It seems to be the main way he displays his love for her is through violent acts.
Yeah, and well, in protection and in a weird way, ownership, right? Like he clearly feels a sense of like, she's
Yeah,
mine,
I'm gonna
to
beat up all
protect, kind
these
of
other
thing.
guys because they're gonna treat you poorly. I would never harm you. Yeah, it's I don't know.
Again, it's kind of like that fantasy element, like wish fulfillment kind of thing for that conservative tilt. And then we get to the emotion of them ending up together, but it's kind of like she's making concessions in her life to be with him, and then ultimately like
She's
she's had a
already doomed
kid.
at that point. She's revealed that she has this virus and that it's
Yeah.
incurable and unknown.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
even when she's living with him for a period of time before she runs off again, like she is like seeing what her life would be like if she was with Forrest, if not, and she feels like she's living a lie, so she runs off again.
yeah,
And that's in the intervening time she has the kid, and then yeah, when then they get married in a very like let's wrap this up with a bow kind of thing, and then it's a tragedy for Forrest at the end of the story again as like a motivation for the character, or like a at least the climax of the story is kind of as he's realizing there's more to life than Jenny, and like going forward, a piece of her will stay with him in the child.
yeah. Again, you could see this as sweet, right? You could see how he loves her. He wishes she could be there with him to share the life they have now, and that he mourns her loss. And I think that is all sweet. Um, but yeah, I mean, it has a lot of other implications that were there for me to where like the emotion didn't land as solidly for me this time around as I think it used to. I did not tear up during this movie. And maybe my my heart has shriveled some since I originally saw this film, but like I don't know, just a lot of these scenes that at times felt a little bit emotionally manipulative, and at other times just kind of hollow. Even just this moment here at the end didn't really touch me. How about you? Did you find you were emotionally connecting with this stuff?
I still did, yeah.
Yeah.
I felt like I buy into the characters enough, and like I said before, I do have a level of nostalgia. Like this was the kind of it was on TV as much as Shawshank
Oh,
was,
sure.
and
Yeah.
I watched it all the time. I watched this movie countless times, and I do think that like I get more out of the relationship in different ways each time. And it's not neat, it's not tidy, like life isn't in some sense, but and I think I get way more out of this than I do from the book, because the book was not, it didn't even have the sort of emotion at all.
Undoubtedly. How about Haley Joe Osment being in this
Yeah,
movie?
I
Uh,
so I love Haley Joel Osment.
yeah.
He's the voice of Sora in Kingdom Hearts,
Oh, I
and
didn't
then
realize that.
obviously he's like got to be one of the most prolific child actors ever. If you look at his like his early work,
Yeah.
Sixth Sense,
Yeah.
AI,
Yeah.
this movie. I mean, he's everywhere, and just
I
it
did
goes
not
on and
remember that
on.
he was the kid in this movie. That was
Neither did
completely
I.
gone. I saw
Yeah,
him, I was shocked.
it's like one of those things where it's like if it's a movie in the '90s and there's a kid in it, it's probably Haley Joel
Or
Osment. You know what I
Macaulay
mean?
Culkin.
Sure, yeah. There's a few of them, yeah, or
Yeah.
like Elijah Wood or something,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
young Elijah Wood. In kind of getting to nearing the end here, I wanted to talk because you've touched on a lot of what I felt, and then there's some critics that I read online. I just want to read this one. Owen Gleiberman of Entertainment Weekly, back in I assume 1994, said that the film was glib, shallow, and monotonous, and reduces the tumult of the last few decades to a virtual reality theme park, a baby boomer version of Disney's America. And the way that it is like the superficial look, I've kind of led up to this, the superficial look at the past. It doesn't deal with the gritty, tough stuff. It touches on them. It says that they existed, but it doesn't deal with a lot of the ramifications. Does more than the book does. We'll give it credit there. But if that is something that you can engage with, like if you're fine with seeing this as like it's candy, it's something kind of like surface level. There, I think there's plenty to enjoy in this movie, but I do think that there's the danger of people who are not willing to engage with this movie in a quote unquote political manner, because many stories are, and this one very clearly has a lean to it. I just still found myself enjoying it, and that's partially probably due to nostalgia, but also like I felt like the performances, the way that the emotion still hit me, like with the Jenny stuff. Like I knew she was gonna die, obviously, but seeing his reaction to finding out that he has a son always gets me. Tom Hanks' reaction.
Well, and her inability to escape her past is tragic.
Yeah.
That is something that is sad. I think I can totally see it.
I think she's a really tragic figure, and like as much as I think she's boiled down in some ways to like motivating the characters, like specifically Forrest Gump, and like she's kind of a caricature of like a liberal that is, you know, bleeding heart liberal that's going to go around and follow the tide in whatever way that that's popular and pulls them. There's something tragic about someone who doesn't get to see their life fulfilled, and then like obviously the tragedy of someone like Forrest Gump who has that long time love is it's just, I don't know, there's something powerful to it. But
Sure.
specifically for me, the thing that gets me teared up is the child, right? Like him moving forward as someone who never probably even considered having a child, and then like how much, you know, how I would assume Forrest would be such a great father. So those are the things that kind of stuck with me there at the end.
I think it is a touching moment. I was glad to see, and I remember that this was a difference, but glad to see again the change that was made from the book, where he is a father as well, but is choosing to not be in his son's life and instead live with I think a stripper and a orangutan and in Las Vegas, I believe it is at the end, like busking. And if you want to know more about the book, listen to our book episode. But it's wild. I can't believe some of the stuff that happens in that book. But I think this is a good place to leave it, to wrap up essentially with our thoughts here at the end. And I've already alluded to it many times. I think this movie's better. I will say I don't know that I particularly like this movie anymore. But when compared to the book, it's just a far cry better. And I can't pretend like there's not some amazing filmmaking going on here, performances, all the above, as we've touched on. So by far, movie is better for this one.
Yeah, movie every time in this case. And in looking around, the online discourse and community agrees with us.
Yeah.
People do not like this book, rightfully so.
Rightfully so.
But I had no idea. We're spreading the word here. You don't have to read the book; just listen to our episode, and the movie's better. You know, where you land on that, I think, will vary.
If you enjoyed our coverage of Forrest Gump, be it the book or the movie, please let us know in the comments. Let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. If you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and like the video. That helps get the word out, helps us to continue to grow, and we would appreciate the support.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. We're on all the social media platforms at Ink to Film.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm, where we release bonus content, including bonus episodes every month. It's also your ability to vote on upcoming projects. This was one such vote. Our patrons chose Forrest Gump. So if you'd like to be in on the next thing that we're going to cover, that's going to be fully Patreon chosen, that's where you're going to want to be.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, and until next time,
keep adapting.